CALPADS Error Resolution SENR0454. Student must have previous grade 12 SENR record. So the first step when troubleshooting any error in CALPADS is always to consult the CALPADS error list. Using the two columns on the left, the error number and the error name, we can reference the correct description and resolution from the error list document. The error description in the third column from the left usually indicates what the problem is with your record and why it had failed validations. Students with post-secondary transition status indicated must have an enrollment record grade 12 in the previous academic year without post-secondary status transition indicated. Okay, so what that means is you have a SENR 0454 triggering because the record from last year is not grade 12, or the post-secondary transition status had previously been indicated. Okay, so let's look at the suggested resolution column. Understanding the error can indicate the conditions in which your submitted record would be accepted, kind of telling you what CALPADS expects, or sometimes it just reiterates what was provided in the error description. So it says, if a SENR record is submitted where the post-secondary transition status indicator equals Y, then there must be a previous academic year SENR record where the post-secondary transition status indicator must not equal Y and be grade 12. The suggested resolution offered says to update the post-secondary transition status indicator in one of the records. So again, we're going to be looking at the rejected record that we submitted and the previous year's enrollment record. And we're going to update one of the two. All right. And then the fields validated column tells you what fields you need to look at. Right? You're going to verify the records between this year and last year. So we're going to use the academic year ID, the grade level code for the student this year and last year. And then we're going to be looking at the post-secondary transition status indicator for the student in last year's record and this year's record. And understanding our student and knowing the data will tell us which of the two records we need to update and make changes to in order to resolve this error. Okay, so it's very important that you know your student's data. You have to know what's expected so we can consult the error list, but sometimes we also have to consult additional documents to understand the field requirements and know what's expected. So we know our students' data, we know what's expected, we can make the appropriate change, right? This is just one of the resources that we can use for reference. Let's look at another. The CALPADS file specifications. Now there's two CFS documents, CALPADS file specifications, CFS, right? There's the forms and there's the Word. This is a screenshot of the forms document, and these can be found on the CALPADS system documentation page. And so we identify the record type that we're looking up, that student enrollment, SENR. We identify the field, post-secondary transition status indicator, and then the definition, right? And this field is an indication of whether or not a student with disabilities is at least 17 years old, participating in a program to assist the student's transition from school to adult life, including education, training, employment, independent living. A lot of times this can be called life skills, but the purpose is this is a student that is 17 years old or older, and the purpose is to facilitate a student's transition from formal education into adult life. And so we're provided with comments, and this is additional information, right? And sometimes they're not useful, but in this particular case, it's going to be very useful, right? And some of the comments are, this indicator should not be populated with the Y until after the initial cohort graduation year. So at this point, if you don't know what a cohort graduation year is, you may have to go to additional training or the CALPADS data guide to find out what a cohort graduation year is, right? So even more documents you might have to reference. Number two, a Y indicates that the student is in a post-secondary transition status, and an N indicates that the student is not in a post-secondary transition status. Also note that there's a blank value allowed for all other conditions. So that's pretty informative about how we use this particular field and how it can be populated. The field should represent whether or not the student is participating in a program within the academic year. All right, so it's relative to the specific academic year of the record, okay? Then the validation, all right? This tells you how this field is validated. And so we know it's validated because we triggered an error. We didn't pass validations. If the post-secondary transition status indicator is a yes or a Y, then the student must have an overlapping active plan SPED record in the same reporting LEA where the education plan type code is 100 IEP. Okay. And the student age on enrollment must be greater or equal to 17. Okay. And the student must be in grade level 12. Got it. 2, if a SENR record is submitted where the post-secondary transition status indicator equals Y and the student's in grade 12, then there must be a SENR record for the previous academic year where the student is grade 12 and the post-secondary status indicator is no. And so that second part of the validation goes directly with number 1 in the columns column, right? Record from the previous year where the student was in grade 12 and the transition status indicator was no or blank. The comments number 1, the indicator should not be populated with the Y until after the student's initial cohort graduation year. So the first year the student is grade 12 and that initial cohort graduation year, you would want to populate that with an N or blank. And that would largely depend if that student is of age. You wouldn't populate it at all if it wasn't for a student with an active special education plan. So we're really going to be focusing in on the student's age and grade level and identifying the initial cohort graduation year, okay? And then here's when it is required. And again, that just reiterates it's required for students with an active IEP that are 17 years old and the grade level is 12. Otherwise, it's not required at all. All right. So at this point, you should have enough information, right? If you have questions, you would probably reference the CALPADS data guide. You can always send in a support ticket, right? The only question I imagine some of you may have at this point is knowing what the initial cohort graduation year is. But if you're familiar with that, you have enough ammunition to resolve this area, right? And so you just consider what you know. You know that the SENR0454 triggers when a student enrollment record is submitted when the post-secondary transition status indicator is yes, but there is not a previous academic year SENR record where the post-secondary transition status indicator does not equal Y. So that tells me that either A, the previous year is not grade level 12, the previous year does not have, or the previous year is grade level 12 and the post-secondary status is a Y, right? Those are the two variables here that will identify SENR0454. Coupled with, we've indicated yes this year in our enrollment record, and last year there was a conflict, okay? So we're going to have to consider this year's record and last year's record. The post-secondary / transition status indicator describes if a student with disabilities who is at least 17 years old is participating in the program, in a program to assist the student's transition from school to adult life, right? And so this is you knowing your student's data. What you want to consider is, I understand the purpose of this indicator. Is it applicable to my student? Am I populating the data correctly in my student information system, right? We also know that a Y indicates that the student is in post-secondary transition status, a no indicates that the student is not in post-secondary transition status, and a blank is allowed for all other conditions, right? So if the student is not 17 years or older with an active IEP and in grade 12, we may not have a reason to report post-secondary / transition status for the student. That might be blank for all other conditions. What are the conditions in which it is expected, yes or no? It's expected yes or no when the student is 17 years of older. If the student has an active IEP and the enrollment is grade level is 12, right? And that's either a yes or no. And the yes or no indicates whether or not the student is in a transition status. Are they receiving services that's assisting them go from academia to real life? They're transitioning from school to an adult life. We also know that the indicator should not be populated with the Y until after the student's initial cohort graduation year. So that's something we want to identify, is this the student's initial 12th grade year? Is this the year that they would normally be expected to graduate on the 4-year cohort plan, right? The reference for the cohort is the CALPADS data guide. And then if populated with the Y, there must be a student enrollment record for a previous academic year where the grade level is 12 and the post-secondary transition status is no or blank. So again, we're really focusing on the student's cohort graduation year, and the post-secondary status indicator, the post-secondary transition status indicator should be a no or blank that initial cohort year. And so that's a lot of information to take in. That's the background. But as we always try to do with these error videos, is provide you with an online demonstration. All right. We want to give you a demonstration of the process of looking at the documents, coming to an understanding, and then resolving the particular error. So at the end of every year, CALPADS has a requirement to exit the student out of the academic year. And in doing so, we may come across an error or two. And so for this video, we're going to look at the SENR0454 validation error, right? And so rather than a batch file submission, this demonstration will be using online maintenance. So here we have a student, and we're going to open the record, and we're going to exit the student because typically it's end of year 3, and we're going to finish the school year by exiting all our students. And this particular student exited on May 27th, and my exit reason is E155, the student is going to be continuing on with their education. And so I'm going to validate, right? And unfortunately, we have, of course, what we expected: validation error found, message ID SENR0454. Student must have a previous grade 12 SENR record. So this is the name, right? This message doesn't provide me much clarity. And so the first thing that I always want to do is reference the CALPADS error list, okay? And so let's drag the error list onto the screen. And here it is. And it says SENR054, student must have previous grade 12 SENR record, right? And so we use the error number and the error name to identify the reference material for our particular error. Okay, so we know we have the correct error. The error description is where you get the problem. Students with post-secondary / transition status indicated must have an enrollment record in the grade 12 in the previous academic year without a post-secondary transition status indicated. All right, so here's our problem, or what where we're going to look is we have to verify that there's a previous grade 12 record, and that record does not have the post-secondary transition status indicated, okay? When trying to resolve the error, we go to suggested resolution, and understanding the error tells us sometimes what CALPADS expects or what would be acceptable and what would validate. If a student enrollment record is submitted where the post-secondary transition status indicator is Y, then there must be a previous academic SENR record where the post-secondary transition status indicator does not equal Y, and the student is grade 12. So that just mirrors the error description. Suggested resolution, update the post-secondary status indicator in one of the records. Okay, so this is key, right? The last part, the suggested resolution, says in one of the record. So if it's appropriate for this record, the previous record is causing the problem. All right, and so let's go back to the student's record. Here it is. We can see that the post-secondary transition status is yes. Okay, so let's close this out. All right, and here's the student's enrollment record. We can see that the student is grade 12 and there's a previous grade 12 record, right? We also can verify that the post-secondary status should be populated by verifying our student has either special education plan, and we can see that with an IEP record of 100. So we know that it's appropriate for the student to have transition status indicator, right? So we'll open this record, right? This is the previous year, and we can go down, we can confirm that the transition status indicator was yes. So why is this incorrect? How do I know I should change this? How do I know that I don't modify this record? And so that's where you have to go to additional documentation. We're talking about field specifications and we're populating data. So I would recommend going to the CALPADS CFS. There's a Word document and there's a forms. The forms is easy to read. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and here it is before you. And I use the SSID enrollment tab, that's SENR, and then I found the post-secondary transition status indicator, okay? And I'm going to read details. Now, let me filter better for the video. Okay, so we have the post-secondary transition status indicator, and here's the definition. This tells us the purpose of the field. It's an indication of whether or not a student with disabilities who is at least 17 years old is participating in a program to assist in the student's transition from school to adult life. All right, including education and training, employment, independent living. So typically we call these transition services, sometimes life skills. And we know these are our students with disabilities who have extended academic careers, right? They extend beyond the 12th grade. Typically, these students will continue with this transition program until they age out, all right? And so we can get further details, right? If we go to the comments, this indicator should not be populated with the Y until after the student's initial cohort graduation year. That's very key there. A Y indicates that the student is in the post-secondary transition status. An N indicates that the student is not in a post-secondary transition status. A blank is allowed for all other conditions. This field should represent whether or not the student is participating in the program within the academic year. Here's the validation rules that trigger the error. If post-secondary transition status is Y, then the student must have an overlapping active IEP, right? We see that. We saw that in the student's record. The student age and enrollment start date must be greater than 17. So when the student's enrollment begins, the student has to be older than 17. And the grade level must equal 12. Okay, so we know those two conditions were met. And then if the SENR record is submitted where the post-secondary transition status indicator Y in the grade 12, then there must be a SENR record for the previous academic year where grade 12 and the status indicator equals in or blank. So going through the CFS tells us how to fix it really, right? Because we know the indicator should not be populated with the Y until after the student's initial cohort graduation year. However, if that student was 17 in that initial year, it's looking for something. But that initial year can have an N because this says if the student enrollment record is submitted where the post-secondary transition status indicator equals Y in grade 12, then there must be a SENR record in the previous academic year where grade 12 and the post-secondary transition status indicator equals N. That was quite lengthy, but it gives us a key. And for this particular student, it tells us that we can go ahead and update the previous record. This has to be populated, yes, but an N is acceptable. And before we do that, let's backtrack a little bit. We have to know what the cohort year is, right? So students are expected to graduate high school in 4 years after their initial entry. So you look and see that the student was in 8th grade in the 14-15 year. And so their initial entry is the 15-16 year, right? And that's 9th grade. So 4 years from 9th grade, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Here's the 4th year. This is the 12th grade year. So this is the cohort year. And although the student may be 17 and in the 12th grade and require a population, the student's not actually in a post-secondary transition status until after this year. This is the normal 4-year window in which students are expected to graduate. So we can update this record with a no, and we can validate and post. Okay, so now we should be able to go back to this record and exit the student without triggering the SENR0454 error. All right. So here we are. The post-secondary transition status indicator is yes. We're going to update the exit date and exit reason. And validate. Yep, validation successful, and then we post the record. So those are things to look for when you have a SENR0454, right? You want to verify that your student has previously had a grade 12 year, right? You want to verify that the student does in fact have an IEP, and you could verify the student's birth date to make sure that they're 17 years of age and older. But more than likely, the problem is that the previous grade 12 record has a post-secondary status indication as yes, and it was not appropriate. And we have to remember that the initial cohort year, that normal 4-year window in which we expect our students to graduate, should not have the post-secondary status indicated with a yes. Okay, and we can find that out by going to the error list and then the field specifications document. Okay, all right, so hopefully that helps you guys resolve the SENR0454 error. And as always, if you need further assistance, please contact the CALPADS service desk. Thank you.